I'm Margaret Evans Smith, and at 68, I thought I had everything figured out. After a long and successful career as a corporate lawyer in Chicago, I was settling into my golden years. My late husband had left me financially secure, and I was surrounded by family, or so I believed. My son Tom is 45 and lives in New York, trying to make it as an artist. He's always been fiercely independent, but despite his best efforts, he's still struggling. I worry about him, but I know he prefers to handle things on his own. Then there's Jake, my nephew, Tom's boy, just 7 years old, with a charm that could sell ice to an Eskimo. But wherever Jake goes, trouble isn't far behind. Aunt Margaret, you're looking as radiant as ever, Jake said with a cheeky grin as he waltzed into my living room one afternoon. I smiled politely, though my stomach clenched. Thank you, Jake. What brings you by today? I asked, already sensing what was coming. He ran a hand through his hair, sheepish. Well, I hate to ask, but I'm in a bit of a bind again. I sighed. It wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. But family is family, right? On the other end of the spectrum is my niece, Linda. Now there's a woman who knows the value of hard work, single mother of 2, always on her feet. Margaret, I can't thank you enough for helping with the kids' school fees, Linda said one day over coffee. I waved her off. Nonsense, Linda. Education is important. I'm happy to help. Then there's Robert, my brother-in-law. Ex-cop, tough as nails but with a heart of gold. He's been my rock since my husband passed. Maggie, he growled over the phone. You've got to stop letting that Jake kid take advantage of you. I knew he was right, but family isn't that simple. It never is. After yet another one of Jake's emergencies, I decided to update my will. I called my lawyer, an old colleague from my firm days. Margaret, are you sure about this distribution? He asked, eyebrows raised. I nodded. Yes. The bulk goes to Linda and her kids. Tom and Jake will get smaller portions. As I hung up, I had the strange feeling that this decision would set off a chain of events. I just didn't know how soon. That night, I sat in my study, looking through old family photos. Tom as a kid, Jake as a baby, Linda at her high school graduation. Where did the time go? And how did things get so complicated? The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. When I opened the door, it was Linda, looking frazzled. Aunt Margaret, I'm sorry to come by so late, but I think you should know, Jake's been asking around about your will. He seems upset. A chill ran down my spine. I had a feeling this was only the beginning of the trouble ahead. But I'm Margaret Evans Smith. I've faced down tougher opponents in courtrooms. Whatever storm was brewing, I'd be ready for it. Little did I know that storm was about to break. The annual Evans family reunion was in full swing, and on the surface, it seemed like any other year. But beneath the laughter and chatter, tension simmered. I stood by the punch bowl, watching Jake work the room with his usual charm. There was something different about him this time, though, a sharpness to his smile that hadn't been there before. Hey, Aunt Margaret, he said, sidling up to me. Beautiful day for a family reunion, isn't it? I nodded cautiously. Indeed, Jake. Are you enjoying yourself? Oh, absolutely. Always nice to catch up with everyone, he said, his voice casual. Then his tone shifted. Speaking of catching up, I've heard you've been making some changes lately. My heart skipped a beat. How did he know about the will? I kept my expression neutral. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Jake. He leaned in closer, his voice low. Come on, Aunt Margaret. We both know what I'm talking about, the will. Cutting me out after everything we've been through as a family? I stood my ground. Jake, my financial decisions are my own business. Now, if you'll excuse me. Before I could walk away, he grabbed my arm, his grip tighter than I expected. We're not done talking about this. The reunion ended, but the tension lingered. Days passed, and though I tried to go about my normal routine, I couldn't shake the heaviness in the air. Then, one evening, everything came to a head. I was in my study when I heard the front door slam, the sound reverberating through the house. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Aunt Margaret, Jake's voice boomed. We need to talk. I stepped out into the hall, and my breath caught. There was Jake, eyes wild, gripping a baseball bat tightly in his hand. Jake, what are you doing? My voice trembled as he advanced, swinging the bat slowly, menacingly. You're going to change that old back, Aunt Margaret, he growled. Right now. Jake, please, I pleaded, trying to stay calm. Let's talk about this rationally. Rational? He spat, his face twisted in anger. Was it rational to cut me out? To leave everything to Linda and her brats? I instinctively backed away, heart racing, my hands shaking. Jake, you're scaring me. Put the bat down. Please. Not until you agree to make this right. His voice cracked with fury. I want it all, Aunt Margaret. Every last penny. In that moment, looking into his crazed eyes, I realized I wasn't staring at the little boy I'd once bounced on my knee or the young man I tried so hard to guide. This was someone else entirely, a stranger. Okay, Jake, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Okay, I'll do it. Just put the bat down. He lowered the bat, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. I knew you'd see reason, Aunt Margaret. We'll go to the lawyer's first thing tomorrow. After he left, I collapsed onto the floor, trembling. How had it come to this? How had things gone so terribly wrong? The next day, I called a security company and had hidden cameras installed throughout my home. It felt surreal, like I was living in a suspense thriller. But the fear was real. I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake might return. And return he did, almost daily. He'd show up unannounced, his eyes darting suspiciously around the house. Just checking in on my favorite aunt, he'd say. But the warmth in his voice was long gone. I'd force a smile, my heart pounding. That's thoughtful of you, Jake. One afternoon, while Jake was supposedly using the bathroom, I noticed my checkbook had been moved. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. After you left, I carefully went through my financial records. Oh my God, I whispered, my hands shaking. Several checks had been forged, all in Jake's handwriting. I called Linda immediately. I need your help, I said, my voice cracking. Over the next few weeks, we documented everything, every forged check, every suspicious interaction. But then Robert uncovered something even worse. Jake's mixed up in some bad stuff, Maggie, Robert said, his voice heavy with concern. There's a local drug ring, and his name keeps coming up. The ground felt like it was crumbling beneath me. As we built our case, Jake's behavior became more erratic. He'd show up at all hours, pacing, muttering under his breath, his eyes wild with paranoia. And then came the night it all fell apart. I was in my study when Jake burst in, more agitated than I'd ever seen him. I know what you're doing, he snarled, advancing on me. You think you're so smart, Aunt Margaret, but I'm not going to let you screw me over. Jake, please, I said, backing away, my heart thundering in my chest. Calm down. Let's talk this through. Talk? He laughed bitterly, his voice cold. We're way past talking. I want what's mine, and I want it now. He lunged at me, grabbing my arm roughly. I cried out in pain and fear. You're hurting me, Jake. Please, stop. Not until you give me what I want, he shouted, shaking me violently. Suddenly, the door burst open. Robert and Linda rushed in, followed by 2 police officers. Get your hands off her, Robert bellowed. Jake spun around, shock and rage flashing across his face. What the hell is this? The officers moved in quickly, restraining him as he struggled and cursed, his face twisted with fury. I sank against Linda, overwhelmed with relief and an unbearable sadness. I'm so sorry, Aunt Margaret, Linda whispered, holding me tight. But it's over now. You're safe. I watched as they led Jake away in handcuffs, still ranting, his voice echoing through the house. My nephew, my own flesh and blood. How had it come to this? As the chaos subsided, I turned to Robert and Linda, my voice shaky and broken. Determined, I took a deep breath and looked at both Robert and Linda. Thank you. I couldn't have done this without you, but now we have to see this through to the end. The days following Jake's arrest were a whirlwind. Linda, Robert, and I spent hours with the police, presenting the evidence we had meticulously gathered. The detectives' eyes widened as they sifted through the financial records and reviewed the footage from my hidden cameras. Mrs. Smith, this is quite extensive, one detective remarked, impressed. You've built a solid case here. I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of pride and sadness. I just wish it hadn't come to this. As news of Jake's arrest spread, Tom flew in from New York. He stormed into my house, his face a swirl of confusion and anger. Mom, what's going on? Why is Jake in jail? This has to be some kind of mistake. I took a deep breath, motioning for him to sit. Tom, there's a lot you need to know. Over the next few hours, I laid everything out, the threats, the theft, and Jake's connections to the drug ring. With each revelation, Tom's expression darkened. "I can't believe it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My own son." The court case was grueling. I sat there day after day, watching as Jake's web of lies unraveled. My years of legal experience proved invaluable, and I worked closely with the prosecution, my voice steady as I testified against my own nephew. When the judge finally announced the verdict, guilty on all counts, I felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sorrow. As Jake was led away, his eyes burned with fury. "This isn't over, Aunt Margaret," he snarled. I met his gaze, my voice quiet but resolute. "Yes, Jake, it is." In the aftermath of the trial, I revised my will one last time, removing Jake completely. It was a painful decision, but a necessary one. 1 year later, I found myself in the backyard, surrounded by family. Tom was playing with Linda's kids, while Robert manned the grill. The wounds from the past year were still there, but they were healing. "Any word on Jake?" Tom asked quietly as we set the table. I sighed. More charges. His drug connections ran deeper than we thought. He'll be in prison for a long time. As we sat down to eat, I cleared my throat, gathering the strength to share something important. "I have an announcement to make," I said, glancing around the table. "I've decided to start a foundation." "A foundation?" Robert raised an eyebrow. I nodded. "To help victims of financial elder abuse. What happened to me? I don't want others to go through that alone." Tom's eyes welled up with emotion. "Mom, that's amazing." As conversation flowed around me, I reflected on the past year, the betrayal, the fear, the hard decisions, but also the love, the support, and the strength I have found, both in myself and in those around me. "To family," I said, raising my glass, "the one we choose, and the bonds we forge through adversity." Everyone echoed the toast, and for the first time in a long while, I felt peace wash over me. The road had been difficult, but I had walked it with dignity. And now, I was ready for whatever came next. If you were in Margaret's shoes, would you have involved the police earlier, or would you have tried to handle the situation within the family? How far would you go to protect a family member who's clearly gone down a destructive path?